Welcome to the Food and Farming podcast from AHDB, keeping levy payers informed and at the heart of the conversation.
Welcome to this episode of the AHDB Food and Farming podcast. I'm Amy Hughes from the Beef and Lamb Engagement team, and today I'm chatting to Lyn Sykes. Lyn is a coach and family farm succession expert from Australia whose work is globally renowned in this space. This episode is part of the Roots to Resilience programme, and we'll be running some events in October all over the country, covering topics along the same lines as the conversation that I have today with Lyn. If you're in a farming business and you're concerned about the future or your role within the business, if you're struggling to have difficult conversations or don't know where to start, or if there's a lot of conflict when you do have these conversations, please do take a listen to this and then get booked onto our workshops. The UK won't have seen anything like this before. They'll be really valuable and a great use of a day for you. So I start by asking Lyn to give an overview of her career and her experience, and then we delve into her top tips for starting these difficult conversations and getting people to the table.
Originally, I was a registered nurse and a midwife, and I retrained as a relationship counsellor. Part of the job as training as a relationship counsellor was to teach communication skills in courses and to groups who invited me to speak. In one of those courses, there was a young man who was an ag consultant, which was pretty progressive, I can tell you, in the late 80s for an ag consultant to come to learn to communicate. And as it turned out, that young man's had a profound impact on my working life. He then asked me, would I speak to his farmer groups about communication and conflict resolution and various things relating to communication. Then a year or so later, I had a call from him one weekend and he said, we're in trouble. He came from a family farm but was working as a consultant. His dad had died probably a year before, and there was a huge amount of conflict in the family between his brothers who were working in the business. There'd been a bit of a bust-up in the sheepyards, and he called me and said, we need help. Every time we try and meet, it ends up in disaster. So we need someone to run a meeting for us who's more bossy and more aggressive than all of us, and we wonder if you'd like the job. So to this day, I'm not sure whether that was an insult or a compliment, but it doesn't sound very complimentary. But anyway, I did, really not having too much idea about what I was doing. I knew some pretty fundamental things about communication, and there wasn't a whole lot around then to help me know what to do. So I just launched in, really. And I'm sure it's no different in the UK, but in Australia, when someone does something in a farming setting that's not helpful, everyone hears about it very quickly. And when someone does something that is helpful, then the word spreads as well. Not nearly as quickly, but the word spreads. And so I found myself running a few family meetings in that part of the state. And as a result, that part of my work just grew and grew, because my interest then, as it is until I retired really, was in holding families together. My interest was not really in farming or money or any of the how much grass you grow. Or my interest was in holding families together. And I saw, once I started to do the work, that this whole issue of succession was creating absolute carnage in families across the country. So I had a very sophisticated process, a bit like some of the things that farmers used to do. I worked out that if it worked, I did it again, and if it didn't work, I didn't do it again. And eventually, when you use that very sophisticated process of decision-making, you end up with a pretty slick process. By the time you've stopped doing all the things that don't work, you've sort of singled out the things that will work. And so then I started being asked to speak at conferences. And there wasn't anyone else. That's the other reason why I've had a lot of experience. It's not that hard to look good when you're the only horse in the race. But because the other people that were doing the work were primarily accountants and lawyers, and they had a very different interest and a very different take on the process than I did. So that's how it started. Little did I know it was going to be taking me to lots of different places in the world, and certainly everywhere in Australia.
So I wanted to start at the very beginning. So You're absolutely right. Like, succession does cause carnage, absolute carnage in farming families. And, you know, I'll speak to a discussion group and I'll clock that somebody's not quite right. And when I speak to them about it, it is always something going on with the family. That is what is happening. Yeah. And a lot of the time over here, it's that very first conversation that people really struggle with. You know, that very first, can we have a sit down and talk about blah, blah, blah. That's the bit that they really struggle with, and it puts people off, and people bury their heads in the sand. And I was watching one of your videos online, and you said worms left unattended turn into snakes, and I just thought that was fantastic. It's so true, isn't it? It just festers.
Yeah, it's not an original statement. Someone said that to me.
You should have claimed that, Lyn. You should have claimed that. So talk us through your top tips, I suppose, of where to start. Like, how do people start those conversations? What sort of language should they be using, and what information do they need in their head to make it a worthwhile conversation?
Even before that, I think it's really good for people to understand the 4 things that I think are really important to understand, that I believe underlie and influence the succession process. First of all is the family history. People tend not to have a great knowledge of their own family history in previous generations. And when I start a family meeting, that was always the first information I get, because many of us are influenced by information that is in our subconscious, that actually relates to our lived experience, but we're often not really aware of it. So that's the first thing, the family history in relation to succession. The second thing is the self-esteem of the people involved. And that is actually an enormous factor that infiltrates every area of the process. The fact that people make a careless error in what they say, and it impacts on people's perception of themselves. I think in relation to succession, the other thing that you can't underestimate is how vulnerable every generation is when it comes to succession. The older generation think that they're the only ones that are vulnerable, and the younger generation think that they're the only ones that are vulnerable. But in fact, they are equally vulnerable, and often that vulnerability is the logjam that many families hit. So that's family history, self-esteem, the ability of families to communicate effectively about anything, but particularly about sensitive subjects. My belief is that to be in a family business, you need to have much better communication skills than you do to be in any other business, because there is so much more riding on it. And lastly is the belief systems of the generations. So getting a handle on what are the important things to each generation in any process is a really important factor, because they're quite different. You know, I look at my children and their belief system seems, I sometimes shake my head and think, who are these kids' parents? I think those 4 things are really important. So the reason I wanted to mention those before we started talking was that any converser needs to have those things in mind and be prepared to be open and honest about each one of those. So in an ideal world, the first conversation about succession starts when children start being involved in any way in farm activity, you know, from really little tackers to when they finish school. But a crucial conversation is the one that happens before a new generation returns to the family business. Because one of the things that makes the second generation vulnerable is often the length of time they've been there before the conversation happens. And so the thing that I hear is that young generation feel trapped, that they've already put what they think are the best years of their working life into their parents' family business, and they feel as though they can't leave and do something else. You know, I would be thinking a really progressive family should not take anyone into their family business whose family until some of those conversations have been had. One of the things that gives the older generation security, really, and a little bit of power is actually having the financial means to not be dependent on the farm. In Australia, we call that superannuation, whether that's actually in a superannuation fund or whether it's in assets off the farm. But the ability to not be reliant on the family business for their ongoing financial needs is an incredibly helpful factor. So if the older generation can secure their income and where they live, the whole process is going to go a whole lot better.
You talked about one of your four main areas being able to communicate effectively. Now, there might be some people listening to this thinking, well, I can talk, I can communicate. Will you just explain what you mean by communicate effectively? What skills do you need to have to be an effective communicator?
When I first started doing this work, I didn't deal with anyone who was thinking about returning to the farm. Some of the people had been there 20, 30, sometimes 40 years, and succession hadn't happened. And I'd say, how's your communication? Oh, pretty good. Yeah. So how did you go getting your sex education? And they say, and there's always a bit of stuttering. And I say, well, my experience about talking to your children about sex is that, you might give a bit of a broad brush about how babies are made, or you might take a little bit of talk about protection. But my experience is not many parents talk to their children about the real nitty-gritty of sex. And if you do, then you've probably got good communication.
Yeah.
So that usually counts out everyone, really, including me.
Imagine. Yeah. I'm dreading that when mine get a bit bigger, yeah.
If you're observant and self-reflective, you're a long way to being able to communicate well. But people will say things and be shocked at the other person's reaction, but not ask them about it. That often is the beginning of conflict. I say something, you react, I then defend myself, you attack me, and we're gone. Away we go, up on the conflict spiral. People underestimate how challenging it is to speak about really sensitive and important things with your own family. People think families are the safest place to communicate, but in fact, they're the least safe because there's so much riding on the outcomes.
And there's so much emotion in it as well, isn't there? Like when you're talking to a business partner or anybody else, it is literally just a conversation. But like you say, within a family, the history that's there will be having such a huge impact, and the emotion that you have for the person that you're speaking to can make you communicate in a very different way, can't it?
You start out wanting your children to be good and well-behaved and polite, and so you spend a lot of time criticising them, has been my experience. That almost becomes the norm. And so anything you say to them, they take as an implied criticism. None of us like being criticised, so we all react. You get caught in that action-reaction.
When you were talking about your early career, it was trial and error, and you didn't do the things that you knew didn't work, and you ramped up the things that did. Is that the same way that people should focus on communication, or do they need to go do a course, or what? How do you develop your communication skills?
Much as most farmers would be horrified to hear this, but I think it's a fabulous investment to do some training in communication. The thing that frustrates me, and if you take it back to being, a young parent, how often do you say to your children, I've told you 1,000 times, put your shoes away when you come in? Mm. You would think that if I told someone something 1,000 times and it didn't work, why would I tell them 1,001? And I think that's what happens in families. I guess it's the same in the UK, but we call it nagging. People nag, and you think, well, why do you keep doing that if it doesn't work for you? And sometimes, people will say, well, I don't know what else to do. And I say, well, don't do anything. Doing nothing is better than doing that.
In terms of having these first conversations, Lyn, where, let's get to the real practical bits of it. Where do these need to happen? Is the family kitchen table the right place? Do you need to go elsewhere? Where would you suggest?
It's pretty common practice now for businesses to meet, to talk about what's going to happen in the business. And certainly, we've spent, it's not my area of expertise, chairing those operational meetings, but I think most progressive businesses, farming businesses now do have operational meetings. And I think that's the starting point, really. And if the conversation about it's not on the table now, and there's more than one generation working in the business, then the best time to start is tomorrow. Somebody has to make a move. I think it's good advice if that move is not made by in-laws.
Okay, do you want to explain that a little bit further?
It's funny, you think farming people tend to think they're the only ones that have difficulties, but my next door neighbours here have a powder coating business. she sent me a text the other day, have you got time for a cup of tea? I said, yeah, sure. So in she came, and they're handing the business over to their son and daughter-in-law. You should hear her, my neighbour says to me. No matter what we offer, it's not enough. She just wants more. Oh, she said, and she's so blunt. I can't believe the way she speaks to us. Now, they have a very compliant son, and I suspect what's going on is the son sells her and she delivers the message.
Mm-hmm.
But she's getting the blame. Those messages would have come so much better from him than from her.
Yeah.
Because, she's a ring-in, really.
Uh-huh.
Having said that, when in-laws phone me and they say, I'm really worried about my security and my children's future and no one will bring it up, I say, look, bring it up. They think you're the problem anyway, probably, so you might as well be the problem. Yeah. Because if it's helpful and it all works out, they'll be appreciative. You will never get any of the credit. But if it goes belly up, you'll be blamed, and that's the way families like it.
That actually moves us on to the next question really nicely. So I'd like to talk about seeing things from both sides. So you've already spoken a little bit about appreciating your own impact on others and the differences between generations. Will you just talk us through this generational differences a little bit more? Because my experience, and it's only because of the work that I do, I tend to hear it from the younger generation side all the time. Yeah. And it's always frustration. Dad won't go. He won't let me do this. He won't let me do that. But there very much is two sides. And I've probably seen it in my own family more than anything. My dad can come across as so difficult. But then when you stop and think about it, he has spent 50 years building that business up. So he's not going to walk away from it in a puff of smoke, is he? Just talk us through. Just talk us through this.
It is so easy to offend, which is why the earlier the conversation is made normal, where if you talk to your little kids, do you think you'll be a farmer? Do you like cattle? If you had to tend this animal, what would you do? Just easy conversation about little simple things. In order to do that, you need to have good basic communication skills to start with. And there needs to be good skills. If it's a couple, if the older generation is a couple, they need to have good communication skills between each other. That's not always the case.
No, absolutely. So if you could sum up, like, worst case scenario, everything's going wrong, how might the younger generation be feeling and how might the older generation be feeling? Like, what are the typical things that you come across when you've been doing work with families in terms of how the differences in generations?
My experience has been both generations are fearful. The older generation is often sad and they're often both angry with each other. Yeah. Because people spend so much time looking outward and so little time looking inward, they spend their time, in this conversation, I spend my time thinking about all the things you're doing wrong and all the mistakes you're making, and you think about the same about me. Yeah. I'm never going to change you. You're never going to change me. The only person I can change is me. Both generations need to be more reflective. The difficulty is if you've had a troubled relationship in your childhood or your youth with one of your parents, that needs to be sorted before you move to the next stage. You don't need to be bringing baggage, because one of the things that I commonly see is that the older generation will start to speak critically and the younger generation, who may well be a university graduate, starts communicating like a gullible child because they slipped back into that established pattern that they're stuck in from their childhood. Yeah. Parents get stuck in the critical, the kids get stuck in the vulnerable. Frequently, people will bring two children into the business who've never gotten on. Why would you do that?
I think people just think it's their right, isn't it, to come back into the business if they want to. And the relationship side of things just is never thought about, is it? It's just never thought about. It's like, it doesn't matter if we don't get on, just get on with working. But it rears its head, doesn't it, in every single day. And the misery that it causes that I've seen in families is just horrendous. But you're right, it is. I mean, everything, it just comes back to the ability to communicate, doesn't it? Let's be honest, everything comes back to the ability to communicate. At what point, Lyn, if somebody's in a family business where, like you've just said, there's some kind of issue from the past that needs resolving before any constructive conversations can happen, And it might be, I mean, it can be either way, but just let's say it's the younger generation trying to get the older generation to have a conversation about this and resolve it, and it just ends up in fireworks every time. What's your advice for pitching the idea of getting somebody like yourself in? Like, how would you pitch that? How do you get people on board to allow that?
I mean, that's tricky because they used to contact me. I mean, I think probably it would be the same there. People who've worked with the people who are already in the field recommend you to their friends. A lot of my work, especially initially, you know, sometimes used to take a call and someone would say, oh, I met you at that seminar you spoke at. And I'd think, now, where was I last week? And I'd say, no, where was that? And they'd tell me, like you, when you said you searched me on the internet and found some workshops in Cooma, that would have to be 15 years ago I did those workshops. So people would say, I met you as though it was yesterday. And in fact, it might be 20 years ago. So having the opportunity to speak at forums was the real stepping stone for me. I would often speak after the person who spoke about grass and before the person who spoke about meat quality. And I'd sort of be jammed into the agenda. Usually first after lunch, when none of the important people wanted to speak, I'd be on. And then as I developed a little bit of reputation, I noticed that I moved up the agenda.
That is exactly what's happening over here. Succession or anything to do with the soft skills. And I hate that phrase, but communication was always just wedged into a gap. And now it is absolutely at the top of people's agenda. If somebody did want to contact you, Lyn, and wanted your involvement in their family, but one of the generations was just like, absolutely not, I'm not having somebody coming into our business and knowing us airing our dirty laundry. Give us some advice. Like, if you were in their position and you were trying to communicate to somebody to say, right, I want to get Lyn Sykes in as a mediator, what would you say? What words would you use? Because this is something that really a lot of people struggle with over here. They know that Sian is available and Heather's available, and they really want to involve them, but trying to persuade whoever to let them be involved is hell.
First of all, get them to a forum where the person speaks, so they get to see them and hear them. Yeah. Alternatively, I would suggest, if you're trying to negotiate, I would say, do you know anyone who's had a facilitated meeting? If you say yes, I say, is it by any chance someone who might be a friend of your parents? And if it is, get them to talk to the person. There's 3 really important questions for people to ask themselves to help them reflect before they talk to anyone. And the first is, what do I want for myself? What do I want for the other person? And what do I want for the relationship? Just taking yourself through those 3 questions helps you think about things from both sides. Because the older generation have been young. They've often been in the exact same situation that they're putting the next generation in. And they're often doing exactly what their parents did to them because they haven't actually communicated about it. I say to the older generation, so how did you come by this farm? And I'll say, it was handed to me by my father. Oh, so when did he do that? And they'll say, oh, when he was 70. Oh, 70. Oh, I'm 69. I'd never connected it with what my father did. So it's like they're operating on an autopilot. So the more of that information that comes to the surface, the less influence it has. Yeah. So I encourage young people to ask their parents about their story. How did you go working with your father? When did you and he start to talk about change? What was it like for you when you started to want to do something different and your father didn't like it?
It's amazing, isn't it? Because just thinking about my own family situation, the amount of times I've heard various arguments going on and somebody shout at my dad, "You're just like your father." But with somebody like you've got to come round to it yourself, haven't you, and have a chance to process that actually that is maybe where this is coming from. But just have somebody shout it at you, of course you're just going to block off, aren't you, straight away?
You'll never think about it if someone makes it as an attack. Yeah. It's got to be a valid question.
Absolutely.
And the difficulty is once you've shouted it 1,000 times, it's pretty hard to ask the valid question.
Exactly. Yeah, you can't. Yeah, you can't shout that 50 times and then be like, tell me about your father. It's just the moment's gone, hasn't it? The moment's gone. Okay, all right.
How did you get him to change his mind? Is a good question. How did you get your father to change his mind?
Well, I think the answer would be I didn't in that situation. Actually, in that situation at our house. But anyway, yeah. Okay, let's talk about another really difficult situation in farming families, and one that I, for one, have never ever heard spoken about publicly over here at any conferences or anything. So we're going to tackle it head on, and that is divorce in farming families.
I mean, I think again, if at the significant point of someone coming into your family, that's when you talk about it. One of the things I learned as I got older in family meetings is that I would ask the older generation, if you're unable to care for yourself, where do you want to be? Because I'd been through the situation of having to decide where my mother needed to live when she could no longer care for herself. And it's a terrible thing to have to do.
Yeah.
So I thought it was a great opportunity when I was there to ask the older people, should that ever happen, what did that, so that the rest of the family hear it and it's documented. I think a bit the same is that instead of being terrified that someone's going to get divorced and take the farm, is to say to, at that meeting, at that pivotal point of change, to say, you know, we're worried. What happens if this relationship doesn't work? And get people to start thinking about it. You know, and often I can remember interviewing a young couple before they were to marry, and I said, you know, what would happen if this relationship, just that exact question, what would happen if this relationship doesn't work? And the young man was the farming inheritor in the future. And he said, oh, I'd look after you. And she said, so what would that look like? And he said, oh, well, I'd set you up in a house in town. She said, your town? Yeah, he said. She said, if we're not together, there's no way I want to be in your town. I want to be, it was in Sydney actually, I want to be back in Sydney with my own family. He was stunned that she would want to live in his town. So just creating those opportunities creates the conversation. So he knew that if they were going to get divorced, the $200,000 that was going to buy a house in the rural town was not going to stack up when she wanted the $1.2 million house in the suburb where her parents lived.
Yeah.
So just sort of gently running those conversations is a really important thing. I think I'm not convinced that one of the major elements in the younger generation separating from their relationships and ending up in divorce is the alienation they feel from their parents-in-law. In some families, the extreme measures that families have gone to protect their assets from their in-laws. You know, if you treat them like an outsider, you shouldn't be surprised when they behave like an outsider.
Once you've had those conversations and, well, hopefully come to some kind of agreement about what would happen, would you encourage people to document that? Would you want it in black and white somewhere?
I actually encourage families, if I had the fabulous opportunity to run a family meeting before any of the next generation were partnered, I encourage them to have an agreement that if someone decided to marry or take a life partner, that they enter into a legal agreement. And that becomes part of the family code of conduct, that if you're going to move on to the farm, then we need to have some sort of agreement, or if you're going to marry, we need to have some sort of agreement. And the younger couple either agree to it or not. I mean, I have run a family meeting where there was a partner absent, and I said, it was a girl, do you think your partner would agree to an agreement about assets? And she said, well, if he won't, then he shouldn't be my partner. And that's what happened. He wouldn't agree.
That is such a difficult one, isn't it, though? Because you can imagine as the incoming partner, as it were, the one that's marrying into the family, you would just be, I don't know, I think I would just be thinking, well, do they think this is going to fail? Do they think we're not right? You know, like the communication around that is so difficult, isn't it? Because it really is just protecting the family business. And the fact is that family business has got multiple people within it. So that's the difference, isn't it?
If the family decide before there's any partners that that's going to be the modus operandi, then it's not such a potential insult to partners. I've heard young men say, well, I've said to my partner, this is an agreement with our family. What are your thoughts about it? I can remember doing a family meeting once, and it was a daughter-in-law, something about the family. She said, well, the second time he took me out, he said, could you see yourself living on a farm? And she said, I don't know why. He said, well, that's where I'm going to be. And if you can't see yourself there, we shouldn't waste any more time.
I know somebody else that's done that. I know somebody, in fact, that might have been my dad. It might have been my dad that did that to my mum. I've heard that story before. Oh, God. Yeah, well, I mean, that gets it out the way. You can't complain about that communication, can you?
And if you think you can live on a farm, we've got an agreement that we have to sort out what's going to happen if we divorce before we marry.
It's a case of it's trying to, like you said earlier, it's about trying to make that partner that's marrying him feel included. Yes, all right, there's an agreement, and that's for the sake of the finances of the business, but that doesn't mean they're an outsider, does it? Do you know what I mean? You've got to move past that and include them in the business and what's going on. So yeah.
And as those significant changes happen, if you start to be involved in the business, then how does that affect the agreement? It has to affect the agreement.
Absolutely.
If I'm contributing more, then the agreement, when I wasn't contributing at all, needs to change.
Right. Last and final area that I want to discuss with you, which again, I mean, I feel like this has started off quite positive and turned into let's talk about all the really hard stuff. But it needs talking about, Lyn, because when we use the word succession over here, and I hate that word, I would much rather we use transition, but that now means something else in farming, so it's quite a difficult one. Every time you say succession, people just think death, and it's something that Heather Wildman says all the time. Succession means death, and that's why people avoid it or won't engage with it when there is stuff going on in the industry. And it doesn't, doesn't it? There's a lot more to succession than death, but ultimately the outgoing person will go out of the world eventually. It happens. It's going to happen to us all. So how do we navigate wills? How do we do that respectfully? How do we make sure that if somebody's not happy with a will, that's communicated before it's too late to do anything about it? Talk us through the will side of things and inheritance.
If we flick back to the positive things that we started to talk about in the beginning, if I've come into a business on a planned, work for equity or however, that transition's going to happen, then the will be less relevant. Mm-hmm. I think succession will be much easier when the will is irrelevant. I've yet to be convinced that the will is an effective way to transfer assets. If you've got nothing else, then the will is the succession plan. So again, if we go back to the beginning, before a new generation comes into a business, they need to know what their career future is. And if the will is the only succession tool, then they need to know what's going to happen to them if there's a tragedy. If in fact that information won't be shared, I think that's a real red flag that maybe this is not a good career move for me. The difficulty is that people are so emotionally bound to farming on their family's business that they often make decisions with something other than their brain. That the flags might be there, but people choose to ignore them. So to me, if we go back to the things that we've said, if I as the older generation can set myself up how I'm going to be financially and where I will live, then in many ways the will is less relevant as you age. The point when wills are really crucial is when you're young, when you're your age. Mm-hmm. What's going to happen? I can remember my husband worked in the canola industry and we were going to Canada to a conference. We had 5 little kids and I was going and I panicked. What will happen if something happens to us while we're away? I went to all sorts of extreme measures to set up how they were going to be managed. I got on the plane and I think I cried for about the first 3 hours of the trip. We both came back alive, so it wasn't necessary. But a will is supposedly a living document. So you can't write it and then forget it for the next 40 years. It needs to be upgraded and refreshed, looked at. Does it need to change? Has anything changed that needs to change in this document? Yeah. A succession shouldn't mean death because The magical part of succession is for an older generation watching the next generation succeed, being able to be there and observe and support and encourage, not criticise and question, support and encourage, and see the fruits of not only their physical labour, but their family labour coming to fruition. It's just such a wonderful gift when you see it in action. You know, I really want to take the focus off the wills and say, if you're on the ball, your will, hopefully in the long term, is not going to mean much. The other thing that is important here, and maybe the same there, is if I'm no longer able to care for myself and I need to go into care, what it costs me is based on my assets. So if I still own a huge chunk of valuable farming land, what I pay to go into care here, I don't know whether it's different there, will be based on that asset. I've actually been involved with farms that have had to be sold in order for the parents to access care. So I always say, when you need to go into care, you need to be poor or very rich.
Yeah.
And not have a business you want to pass on.
I think what you just said about the positives of a good succession plan, I think that's what we'll leave it on Lyn, because that's absolutely, you know, I deal with both sides of the sword. I speak to people that have got it nailed, and they have such incredible communication between a family, and I speak to people and live with people in some cases that are the total opposite, and the difference that it makes to farming businesses and the people is just it's just amazing, isn't it, when you get it right, or at least try, you know, get it some way near rather than just ignoring it.
Imagine the joy of driving around in a vehicle with two generations in a paddock like the one behind you, the enormous pride that they can both feel and share for the previous contribution and the future contribution. It's, you know, it really is an absolute joy.
Yeah.
If, in fact, that's not the case and it has all gone to the dogs, my advice is bring it to a head, get it over with as quickly as possible, finish it up so that the family has time to heal while people are around. I think one of the nicest things I've ever had said to me was at a conference in a sheep, I think, and it went to questions afterwards. And a guy stood up who I recognised, and he said, Lyn ran a family meeting for us. And of course, my thought was, oh God, was it a disaster or was it helpful? Because you never quite know what people are going to say in a public forum. And he said, unbeknownst to us, my father was to die 6 weeks later. And he said the most wonderful gift was that we could grieve without it being contaminated by the family business.
So there we have it, a fantastic conversation with Lyn Sykes from Australia. We don't like talking about the touchy-feely stuff over here, do we? It's really difficult sometimes to get these conversations going or to have the confidence to say what we want and understand the other people around us. But as Lyn said, it can be a really wonderful thing for all generations involved in the business to watch the business grow and develop. But people do have to be on the same page and understand each other from the outset. So if any of this resonated with you today, please do book onto our workshops in October. We've got Elaine Fraser coming over from Canada. Elaine is a family farm coach and specialist in this area as well. She has her own podcast. She's an award-winning author, and her work has influenced over 9 million people across the world. They really will be a great use of a day for you. Visit the Roots to Resilience website to find out more.
If you have any comments about this podcast or have ideas for future episodes, please email foodandfarming@ahdb.org.uk.